Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Britons. The goal here isn't to give a strategy guide for gameplay, which I have done recently in another video, but instead to look at the connections between the Britons in Age of Empires 2 and their real-life historical inspiration. I'll be breaking this video into two parts. The first half will focus on some major events in medieval English history to give a bit of political context, and then in the second part I'll go through the Britons' bonuses and tech tree strengths and weaknesses to speculate on their historical connections. To start with, the earliest use of the term Britons was by Greek and Roman writers to describe the inhabitants of Britannia. Despite some cultural similarities, Romans at the time made a clear distinction between Celts in Gaul and the peoples of Britain, who took on a sort of mythical status as being especially tall and strong. The Britons in Age of Empires 2, though, are not representing the classical age Britons that the Romans encountered. Instead, they represent the Anglo-Saxons and the Kingdom of England. This is obvious from the in-game history section, which speaks almost exclusively about English history. Had you actually visited Britain in the Middle Ages and asked to meet some Britons, you would be directed to Wales, Cornwall, Cumbria, or Strathclyde, depending on which point in the Middle Ages you visited. The terms Britain and English are sometimes accidentally interchanged, which you can hear in the Joan of Arc campaign, where the English are referred to as British on several occasions. All this to say the Britons in AoE2 are really, in all but name, the English. Now, the first step toward the formation of medieval England can be traced back to the early 400s, when Rome withdrew its legions from Britain to Gaul to defend against invasions from Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, among others. The Romans were also involved in a large-scale war in Italy against the Visigoths around the same time, and took what troops Britain had left, suggesting they look to their own defenses. The Angles and Saxons were often used as foederati or mercenaries by the Romans in Britain, protecting the eastern coast from raids by other Germanic peoples. These mercenaries then settled and encouraged further Germanic migration. As a result, Germanic languages began to have dominance over Roman Latin and the native Brythonic languages. Even the name England itself comes from land of Angles. New immigrants mixed with the local population and soon formed what's called the Heptarchy of 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. These kingdoms fought each other regularly and showed very limited signs of unity. This internal weakness attracted Viking raids from Norway and later Denmark. In the beginning, they raided coastal towns and monasteries, but eventually these raids would develop into more ambitious expeditions with larger armies. Of particular note was the Great Heathen Army that invaded England in 865 and managed to occupy and hold a significant amount of territory. This invasion is depicted in the scenario of York, with the player taking on the role of the Vikings. One possible victory condition is to defeat 5 out of the 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, which is fairly accurate to history, as all except the Kingdom of Wessex were either crippled or completely conquered. The Anglo-Saxon reaction to these invasions was to fortify their borders with so-called boroughs. These towns were better fortified and held administrative power over the border regions, giving better protection to outside raids. These are one possible inspiration for their cheaper town center bonus. The region held by the Vikings was called the Danelaw, which they held for nearly a century before being reconquered by the earlier mentioned Kingdom of Wessex. This is the point in the early 900s that we start to have a king of the English for the first time. Wars with the Vikings would continue on and off, and for 2 decades England was even under the rule of a king named Canute, who formed the short-lived North Sea Empire, which also contained Norway and Denmark. Shortly after, in 1066, the English king Edward the Confessor died childless, with several people laying claim to the throne. Amongst them was the Earl of Wessex, Harold Godwinson, who got the crown first and successfully defended it against Harold Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. This is seen as the end of the Viking Age in England, and in Age of Empires it's depicted as a short fight where bombard towers carry the battle. Finally, England was able to sit back and relax now that centuries of invasions had been put to rest. I'm just kidding. Within days, southern England was invaded by the Normans, led by William, Duke of Normandy. He defeated Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings, earning him the title the Conqueror. All of these events are captured in the Hastings scenario, where you play as William, including an optional objective to join forces with Harold Hardrada and rewrite a bit of history. The Normans themselves were originally Viking settlers in northern France, so it might seem like a logical Viking team-up. But in reality, they were competing claimants to the throne who spoke different languages by this point, so it's hard to imagine them actually fighting together. The Normans confiscated lands from any English elite that resisted them and replaced them with Norman administrators. Shortly after William's death, the division between England and Normandy re-emerged, with each being ruled by one of his sons. The fact that the Normans were a duchy of France meant English kings were now connected to Norman royalty and led to intermarriage between French and English nobles. This helped noble families secure alliances and trade relations with territories outside of their courts. But on the flip side, it could also spark trouble when several close relatives could lay claim to the throne. This happened in 1328, with the English King Edward III claiming the French throne, as his mother was a sister of the previous French king. The end result was the 100 Years' War, which is partially depicted in the Joan of Arc campaign. In Age of Empires, this is really as late as we go in terms of how the Britons are depicted, as they're mostly represented as pre-gunpowder. Gunpowder was just starting to catch on in Europe around this time, and it's also the last chronological appearance of the Britons in a campaign. So hopefully that gives enough of an overview for some political context of medieval England. Now let's take a look at their bonuses and tech tree decisions to find some historical connections. We'll start with their early game eco bonus for faster collection from sheep. This one's fitting given the importance of wool as an export for England, which I've seen described as the backbone of medieval England's economy. English wool was highly valued, and it was easier to transport by boat than many other raw materials. Something that's light and easy to transport is quite handy when you live on an island. The bonus even mimics history at a deeper level as well, in that it's primarily for the early game. By the late Middle Ages, England's dominance of the wool market was starting to be challenged by others, like the Italians, Dutch, and Spanish, with the introduction of merino wool. The idea that sheep give the English an early economic boost that falls off over time really couldn't be more accurate. For their other economic bonus, I already mentioned I think the cheaper town center could be inspired by the boroughs that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms built. This bonus is a bit harder to justify though. Medieval England's population was always dwarfed by France and even more so by the Holy Roman Empire. The British Empire is another matter entirely, and outside the scope of Age of Empires too, but the idea of medieval England out-booming their enemy through a larger population is admittedly a bit odd. It's possible this was given as just a mid-game bonus that synergizes with archers. But speaking of archers, that's really the Britons' identity, with the player being heavily pushed toward playing them through the entire game. They have an archer unique unit, a civ bonus increasing their foot archer's range, as well as a team bonus for faster archery ranges. In this regard, the term Britons would be apt, as the longbow is a Welsh invention. Becoming effective with the longbow was a lifelong process, both in terms of skill, but perhaps more so in developing the necessary body strength. The skeletons of longbowmen can be identified by physical changes to the arms and hands due to the intense conditioning that goes into using the bow well. Unlike in modern times, a medieval military force wasn't a professional standing army. Only the king and the most prestigious nobles had a permanent personal guard who accompanied them in battles. These made up the commanders, cavalry, and most skilled infantry, numbering in the thousands at most. The majority of the army was levied from towns and villages across the kingdom, and each community was expected to provide a number of soldiers proportional to their wealth and population. There were also laws stipulating what military equipment was expected for each social class. The majority of free men would have been expected to own and be prepared to use a bow in battle. Archery practice was a legal requirement, and at some points there were even restrictions on when people could play football or other sports that didn't involve the bow, in order to encourage more archery. Technically, until the Betting and Gaming Act of 1960, it was still illegal in the UK to partake in any sport besides archery on Christmas Day. The tradition of archery and extensive use of the longbow of course inspired their unique tech, yeoman, as well, which gives even more range to archers as well as extra attack on towers, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The term yeoman can have different meanings, but in this context it refers to a class of land-owning citizen in England or Wales who would have most likely used the longbow in battle. The large emphasis put on archery isn't an exaggeration either. Especially during the start of the 100 Years' War, there are several battles where the longbow played a critical role in English victories. Agincourt is probably the most famous example, where an English army made up almost exclusively of English and Welsh longbowmen defeated a significantly larger French army. A necessary part of the longbow's effectiveness, though, was that the army had time to set up proper defenses, like sharp wooden stakes in the ground to deter cavalry charges. In battles where English longbowmen were caught by surprise, they proved to be largely ineffective. Still, the intention for Britons to go almost exclusively with archers, even against heavy cavalry, has historical justification. Now, they did naturally use infantry, and Britons have fully upgraded champions and halberdiers. The inclusion of halberdier is a good one to reflect the late English medieval preference for billhooks and halberds, which were more flexible than the Flemish and Swiss-style pikes employed by many other European powers. An example is at the Battle of Flodden in 1513, where an English army armed with bills performed much better than a Scottish army using French-supplied pikes. Of course, the English did use cavalry as well, and that's shown in having at least some options and upgrades. In many cases, though, they would dismount during actual combat. For example, in the 100 Years' War, the French made extensive use of heavy cavalry in battle, while the English generally fought exclusively on foot or used lightly armored mounted troops called hobblers. Even then, they'd often dismount when actually engaging the enemy. Another argument is that the Hundred Years' War and War of the Roses so thoroughly decimated the English nobility that it became increasingly difficult to put large numbers of knights on the field. This could explain the lack of strong late-game cavalry in the tech tree. Looking now at their siege, Britons have a decent variety, plus a unique tech for improved trebuchet accuracy and blast damage. The English warwolf that inspires their unique tech is the most famous and likely largest trebuchet ever constructed. It was built in 1304 to besiege Stirling Castle. Even before its construction was complete, the Scottish soldiers offered surrender, but the English King Edward was naturally excited to see it in action and refused to accept until it had been built and tested. The tech providing 100% accuracy and therefore being able to reliably kill individual units it's targeting is obviously unrealistic though. Moving on to the navy, like most medieval kingdoms outside the Mediterranean, England didn't have a large standing navy with purpose-built warships. Generally, there wasn't a clear distinction between warships and merchant ships until the 16th century. As you might expect then, the Britons' naval tech tree is fairly open, but doesn't have a unique unit. With the Britons' tech tree and bonuses out of the way now, let's finish up with a few of their more cultural references. In terms of language, like other civilizations, Briton unit speech is historically derived. The Age of Empires wiki has published a translation table and identified it as Old English and Early Middle English. A lot of the words are recognizable and similar to modern English words like chopper, gatherer, hunter, and firm. What's a really interesting touch though is that the monks and kings speak Latin. Clergy and the ruling elite would be taught how to read and write Latin, whereas the peasantry would only know what they could pick up at church services. In fact, for 350 years after the Norman conquest, there was no attempt made to encourage English nobles to speak English, and instead French would have been their first language. Taking a look now at their wonder, originally it was Aachen Cathedral. That's actually a German cathedral though, given to the Britons due to deadlines in completing Age of Kings, but their wonder was replaced in Definitive Edition. The new wonder resembles Chichester Cathedral from West Sussex, which was originally built in the 11th century and has been given the title the most typical English cathedral. Elements of the wonder also strike me as being quite similar to Salisbury Cathedral though. Either way, the new wonder is much more authentic than it was before. The coat of arms, which appears in Definitive Edition, has been in use since 1154, when the House of Anjou inherited the throne of England. The three leopards on the shield represent England, Normandy, and Anjou. So that's an overview of the historical connections between the Britons and medieval history. Thanks to both CommentX and Dr. Andrew Lamb for all of their help in researching and fact-checking. Big thanks as well to Jean-Paul, Zach, James, Daniel, Noah, Gabe, Brian, Connor, and Samantha, as well as everyone else on Patreon for supporting the channel and enabling me to make these sorts of time-intensive videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.